What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Italy versus Austria in the UEFA Euros, continuing with the match analysis of the Euros. So before we start, check out my book. There's a link in the description below. The next one's going to be out really soon, so be on the lookout for that. And check out Keyframe, which is how I made this video and how I make most of my videos. So be sure to check both those links out in the description below, and let's get right into it. So when Austria were building from the back, they had two central defenders split by the goalkeeper. They then went with three central midfielders and then a front three. The two wingers would play in the wide area and create dual width to start in their initial phase of their build-up. Then Italy would counter this with a back four, three midfielders, and a front three. So the big thing in the build-up for Austria was their use of the third man movement and how they overcame the Italian press. So in their first phase of build-up, they would often try and access the wide players who are the free players in the structure. So to do this often would involve the interior central midfielders of Austria and making them part of the third man movement. So they would often play entry balls into the man-marked central midfielders and then look to release the fullbacks. Or the fullbacks would then just come more narrow, or the fullbacks would just come deeper and receive the ball outside of the cover shadow and try and progress in the wide area. But when Austria weren't safe in build-up, they would often play mid-range passes into the half space to then try and collect the second ball. First 20 minutes of the game, and in the first half especially, the most important trend was the rest defense for both teams. Now Austria looked a little exposed at time, and Italy got their best chances in the first 15 to first 20 minutes off of transitions. So Austria's rest defense shape consisted of two central defenders and their holding midfielder. So when Italy would win the ball, oftentimes they would have their five-man midfield ahead of the midfielders of Austria, as well as Immobile, their central forward, to then transition against the three defenders involved in the rest defense. So what this did is it gave Italy a lot of room to work with, especially in both of the half spaces, which we've highlighted here. So this made Italy very dangerous in transition, and as well Austria had some good transitions. And Austria had some good transitions as well, but Italy looked a little bit more secure with their rest defense. So now with the low occupation of players in the first line of build-up for Austria, the overloads came between the lines and in the half space. So typically in each of the half spaces between the lines, they would have two players occupying each area, which gave them an overload and allowed them to manipulate Italy's block, or at least attempt to do so. So with the four-man back line, it was relatively easy for Austria to pin and narrow these players to then try and access their single width in the wide area, or break the lines directly through their overloads between the lines. The single width remained the same, with Alaba and their other fullback creating width, but also Alaba coming inside, as we see here, using interchanges to get in more advanced positions. The three-man build-up was good for was progressing past the Italian central forward, Immobile, and creating a 3 versus 1, which led to easy progression further up the field. And from here, they would often have a lot of connections to each corridor of the field. So they'd have central corridor options in both of the half spaces as well. So they'd have three passing options, as well as dual width to free up some movement, to then have players invert to make those overloads, as we saw in the last picture. But the main emphasis, and especially if you rewatch the first half, should be the rest defense and how each team controlled the transitions and how they were each broken in transition. So again, another course of progression for Austria was through their central defender. When their holding midfielder would favor one side, it would then create space and manipulate the positioning of Immobile to then free up space for the central defender of Austria to then progress into, and this would really look to pull out a midfielder or displace a midfielder from the Italian shape. And with the Italian shape, the fullbacks would be readily available to jump. to players inverting between the lines from Austria, as we see here, which would leave a lot of space in behind, which wasn't quite utilized as an outlet ball for Austria. But when the fullback would jump for Italy, it would definitely leave space to be exposed and behind, but wasn't quite found because they didn't have the runs into these areas as well as the support. But they did have dual width on one side, using a little bit of asymmetry, and with Alaba on the left hand side, it gave them a little bit more freedom tactically because of the ability of Alaba to play in multiple roles. It gave them more freedom to adjust tactically through the left hand side. But then we have, with our inverted winger, we have three midfielders and our holding midfielder joining the two central defenders in their initial progression, which then left single width on the right hand side with the fullback. Another route of progression for Austria was using blindside movements of their holding midfielder, which would then create passing lanes from the wide central defenders into the holding midfielder. So a lot of times when in the initial build-up, teams are forced to play with three playmakers in the first line of build-up because of their goalkeeper being involved in this phase. So oftentimes it becomes easier for teams with three front players to press, but the single pivot made it a little bit harder for Immobile because of his horizontal movement and the pinning of the Italian midfield by the Austrian two advanced midfielders, creating more space for their holding midfielder to then directly break the line and progress the ball. And with dual width, it forced Italy to defend a wider area and stretched Italy horizontally, which undid their horizontal compactness, making this passing option available and giving him more space to progress through. In the second half, things didn't change very much, and they didn't really have to change until they conceded a goal in overtime and they really had to push to go for it. They changed some personnel and really went for the game. But for the most part, they built from the back, tried to at least, with their goalkeeper, two central defenders, and their three midfielders. And here we see now the positioning of the holding midfielder was to favor the space around the central defenders and try and give them more room on the ball. As we see Immobile changing his position to a bit deeper now, taking away the holding midfielder from a deeper area. But by playing higher up the field, the holding midfielder then creates more space for the central defenders to drive into and then play the wide areas directly. And here's a situation with the two central defenders on the ball and the holding midfielder. And I wanted to show this picture because of the clarity that we see the advanced passing options of the holding midfielder through, and how Austria prioritized making these positive connections, especially into the half space, and trying to utilize these overloads. So with Italy's five-man midfield, we then see Austria try and create overloads of themselves in the half spaces, but still creating positive connections and strong connections to these players between the lines to then try and progress the ball. Now for Italy in possession, they lined up with a back four, but in the midfield third and in the final third, they would then switch to an asymmetric back four, which would give them a three-man central defender or three-man build-up system. But in the first third, they used their goalkeeper to split the two central defenders, their double pivot, then staggered themselves, which allowed them to create a three-man midfield, and the variability of their front three also became a threat with their forward dropping a little deeper, Immobile, and then this gave the wingers a little bit more ability to threaten in behind and try and access the space that was left by jumping central defenders of Austria. And in the first phase of build-up, this is the only time we really see true dual width used, because oftentimes as we move higher, then we'll see the wide areas used in a very specific way, and often used in outward rotations of central players moving wider. Austria played with 4 defenders, and then they played with 5 midfielders, and at times it would look like a 4-1-4-1, sometimes it would look like a 4-5-1, and others it would look like a 4-4-2. But at the base of it, it was a 4-5-1, which gave them flexibility to defend against a very strong Italian side. So right away after their initial progression, we see the use of 3 central defenders in their first phase of buildup, and now we see dual width used again, but this is used in a very specific way now, as I mentioned before. So before we get to that, we'll see the double pivot, which was also used in a very key way, and often their movement dictated how the offensive structure of Italy changed, which we'll look at more. They had one advanced midfielder who always played in the right half space, or virtually always. His starting position was very consistent, which allowed the same side winger to occupy the wide area, and of course Immobile playing through the center. One thing to note about the double pivot is Jorginho was the lone 6 and allowed Verratti to play more as the 8, but they would always keep a relatively similar distance between each other, but stagger themselves, and their movement was often deliberate in creating space for their central defenders to then go and press against Austria's defensive setup. So here's an example of how Austria's defensive setup could look like a 4-1-4-1, with midfielders accommodating their role to then try and match up against the Italian offensive structure. So a clear 4-1-4-1 against Italy's offensive shape, just about to key the movement. And some of the movements we'll see is an inverted winger coming off the wing through dual width, accessing the half space and creating a 4-man midfield. We'll see the double pivot vary their positioning in relation to the first line, which creates space and allows the central defenders to progress the ball, or it allows the holding midfielder to receive the ball in the half space and then create dual width of the asymmetric back 4 and one of the wider central defenders to then occupy the wide area as a fail-safe if their possession gets isolated. So here's an example of the double pivot going between the central defenders and the wide central defender just off into the wide area here, moving wider, creating asymmetric connections. Now the double pivot, the left-sided central midfielder is on the ball, and the central defender moves into the wide area, because now if the central midfielder gets isolated, he can easily play to the central defender and restart the attack, changing the angle of the ball. But from here, we have our 3 advanced players occupying space between the lines, and now the Italian structure moves to single width. If we just look at the fullbacks and wingers, now the offensive structure switches to single width, with now the wide central defender just starting to occupy the deeper wide area, but the rotation between winger and fullback has changed, so now it's just one wing back into the wide area, with the 3 initial playmakers of Italy staying in their first line role. This movement and variability from the Italian offensive team pretty much forced Austria to play with a 4-5-1 because of the flexibility it required to have access to the double pivot, as well as control the 3 players between the lines and the movement from and to the wide area. Another big form of movement from Italy was with the double pivot, and when the double pivot were central and just splitting the central defender, this allowed the 2 wide central defenders to then fan out a little bit and change their height and move a little bit higher up the field. So this created almost 4 passing options for the deepest central defender or the player most actively involved in circulation. So by creating this, he had access to both half spaces and the central corridor to break the initial line of Austria through multiple avenues. From here, the players then had three advanced options, and by staggering the numerical occupation of the horizontal lines in the structure, by changing whether a team occupies each line with an odd or even number, often can create natural staggering. So as we see, 1 player occupies the first line, we can say 4 players occupy the next line, and then typically 3 occupy the more advanced line. So what this does is it creates a staggering in their offensive shape and creates natural triangles from each of these players, which then makes it harder for Austria to defend against and forces them into more complex defensive shifting movement. Now from Austria, we can even say that their formation here from their 4-5-1 is a 4-3-2-1, and often was the case because of their need to gain access to the holding midfielders of Italy, because of how dangerous Italy can become if the holding midfielders are able to break lines, especially the first two, and then dictate play into more advanced areas. And one more thing to look out for with Italy when they progress into the next round and whoever they play in the next round is the movement of their double pivot and moving into advanced area. So we have our wingers, our central forward, and our other inverted winger occupying the advanced areas. So obviously with the ability of this winger to come between the lines into the half space, we then see the advancement of Marco Verratti going into advanced areas and creating overloads and four-man occupation between the lines. So this leaves Jorginho as the lone central midfielder, and it gives him more players to play into advanced areas, but it leaves them a little bit more exposed in transition, which something if we just have a little bit stronger team playing against them defensively and in their offensive transition, this could be a weakness for Italy when they get exposed and when they lose possession if they leave Jorginho as the lone midfielder and send their other double pivot as playing more of an 8 and send him into advanced areas. So this is one weakness that I would pick up, and teams could potentially expose in transition, especially if they use their defenders, their central defenders, asymmetrically and push them into the wide areas. It could create distances and gaps in their rest defense that could be exploited in the next round. So be sure to look out for that. But that wraps up this analysis. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.